In this video, I'll be demonstrating how to hand sew a pick stitch. In order to hand sew a pick stitch, you'll need needles, a needle threader, thread, and scissors. Also, the back stitch template that we used for both the full back stitch and the partial back stitch. Now, I've been working my pick stitch on one of my back stitch templates. I worked it for 6 rows, and it is a virtually invisible stitch. You can see this pretty well because I'm using a contrasting thread. But if I used a thread that matched my muslin color, then it would be much harder to see. So to get started with the pick stitch, I am going to begin with an anchor. And the anchor for the pick stitch is going to be smaller than the anchors that we've worked with before. So I'm going to enter at the first marking and come out at the first marking. So I'm only gathering a small piece of the muslin and pull through. I'm not going to pull all the way through because I did not form a knot this time for my anchor stitch. I'm going to let my anchor catch my thread and hold it in place. So now I'm going back over the same first marking. One, two, three times to create my anchor stitch. And I didn't even have to form a knot. Okay, now I'm going to begin my first pick stitch by entering at the same point that I did for my anchors, but I'm going to come up at the next marking, which is right here. To make your pick stitch, you're going to go directly behind where your thread came up. That's what makes it another form of the back stitch. You're going behind your thread and then coming up at your next marking. So I'll enter just behind the thread and I'll come up at my next marking to make my next pick stitch, which is just a little dot in the fabric. The pick stitch can be used and is used as a decorative stitch, but many seamstresses find that this is a great stitch to use to hand sew zippers, especially if you're using a thread that is a matching color. You will not see these stitches, but they're very strong because it is a form of the back stitch. So it would hold that zipper firmly in place. So I'm going to keep working my pick stitch all the way down to the end of the row, following the same pattern where I go behind my stitch and come up at my next marking, behind my previous stitch and up at the next marking. If you don't go behind the stitch, you're not securing it as a back stitch. Okay, I'll continue working my pick stitch and I will come back when I am finished. with this row and show you how to anchor it in place. Okay, so I've made it to the end of the row of my pick stitch, and I want to show you how to finish off using the anchor at the end. So I'm going to make my final pick stitch, entering right behind the thread, coming up, and I'll make 2 more right over that pick stitch. 1, 2, and that has created my anchor stitch, and I can go ahead and cut that off. And I've completed my row of the pick stitch. So now I'm going to make 3 more rows to make my final 10 rows of the pick stitch without the markings. I'll crease it to make a line for me to follow. And I'm going to begin in the same way that I began before with my anchor. Remember, this anchor is smaller because the pick stitch is a smaller back stitch. So I'm only going to pick up a small portion of the fabric. I did not tie a knot again, so I'm not going to pull all the way through. I'll make 2 more. 1, 2. Now that I've created my anchor stitch, I'm going to start my pick stitch using the same method as I did before. Coming just slightly behind the stitch that I made and coming up. That's 1. 2. And I'll keep making these stitches all the way to the end of the row. There we go. All right, when I come back, I'll show you a final product of what it should look like in the end. Okay, so I've made it to the end of my final row. I have a few more pick stitches to go, and then I am going to end with my anchor. So now that I'm at the point to end, I'm just going to make 2 more pick stitches over my final stitch, and then I'll be ready to cut that strand. So now that I have finished my final row, I have 10 rows of the pick stitch, and it should look something like this. Of course, if I flip it over on the back, you can see that it is in fact a back stitch because of the way that my stitches overlap each other, and that is the pick stitch.